December 7, 1941 did not begin with explosions. It began with certainty, in the quiet confidence of men who believed they understood their enemy better than the enemy understood itself. At 7:55 a.m., as the first Japanese bombs tore into Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Fleet erupted in fire, the attack was not just a military gamble. It was the physical expression of a fatal intellectual mistake. Within 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. 21 warships were sunk or crippled, and black smoke rose over Battleship Row. To observers in Tokyo, this seemed like the opening stroke of a brilliantly calculated war. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, meeting officials of the Home Ministry only hours before the strike, expressed calm assurance. In a memo later revealed decades afterward, he declared himself relieved, convinced that under current conditions, Japan had practically already secured victory. That confidence would become one of the most catastrophic misjudgments of the 20th century. As a historian of the Second World War, I can say plainly, Japan did not lose the Pacific War because of Pearl Harbor. Japan lost it because of what its leaders believed about America before a single bomb fell. The tragedy was not ignorance of American strength. Japanese planners possessed remarkably accurate data on U.S. industrial output, shipbuilding capacity, oil reserves, and steel production. They knew the United States produced more automobiles than the rest of the world combined. They understood the scale of Detroit's assembly lines and the staggering potential of American factories if fully mobilized. Yet numbers alone do not determine strategy. Interpretation does. And here is where fatal error entered the equation. Japanese pre-war assessments combined precise industrial statistics with profoundly distorted cultural assumptions. Many within the Japanese elite regarded the United States as materially powerful but spiritually hollow, a nation of individualists obsessed with comfort, entertainment, and profit. American society appeared loud, commercially driven, and fragmented. Hollywood films, jazz culture, consumer advertising all reinforced the impression of decadence. To Japanese observers steeped in traditions of hierarchy and collective duty, America looked soft. Even diplomats who admired American engineering often dismissed its cultural depth. Reports from Nagoya and Tokyo described Americans as technically capable, yet intellectually shallow, pleasure-seeking, and unwilling to endure prolonged hardship. These perceptions hardened into doctrine. Two ideological foundations supported this worldview. The first was Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, a belief in unique moral and spiritual superiority forged through centuries of imperial tradition and sharpened during the Meiji Restoration. Japan's rapid transformation from feudal isolation to industrial power seemed proof that collective will could overcome material inferiority. If spirit had defeated backwardness in the 19th century, surely it could offset American factories in the 20th. The second pillar was Bushido, the warrior ethic emphasizing honor, loyalty, and death before surrender. Japanese soldiers were trained to regard sacrifice as virtue and capitulation as shame. Military planners projected this mindset onto strategic calculations. They assumed Americans, lacking equivalent indoctrination, would recoil from mass casualties. They believed the U.S. public would demand compromise once faced with a distant, bloody war 5,000 miles from home. This was not mere propaganda for the masses. It was conviction among decision-makers. The memory of American isolationism in the 1930s, the trauma of the Great Depression, and debates in Congress reinforced the belief that the United States lacked staying power. Historical analogy compounded the error. Japanese leaders studied Russia's collapse in 1905 and assumed democratic societies fractured under strain. They interpreted America's diversity as weakness rather than resilience. If the opening blow at Pearl Harbor was born from certainty, the philosophy behind it was born from faith. British historian H.P. Wilmot later identified the animating core of Japanese strategic thought. Japan was not merely a state, but a sacred polity, a nation believed to be guided by divine origin and ruled by a living embodiment of that divinity. Within such a worldview, defeat was not simply unlikely. It was spiritually inconceivable. Yamato Damashi was not a slogan shouted at rallies. It was treated as strategic insurance, the ultimate guarantee that material inferiority could be overcome by moral superiority. Steel, oil, and tonnage were measurable. Spirit was not. And because it could not be measured, it was assumed to be limitless. In Tokyo's war councils, the contrast was framed almost as destiny. America possessed machines, Japan possessed soul. That belief did not arise in a vacuum. It was reinforced by memory, selective, powerful memory. In 1895, during the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan had stunned the Qing Empire, seizing Taiwan and asserting dominance over Korea. A decade later came the even more intoxicating triumph, the Russo-Japanese War. Against a vast European empire, materially superior on paper, Japan had prevailed. The surprise strike on Port Arthur crippled Russian naval strength at the outset, and though the land war in Manchuria was savage and costly, Japanese endurance held firm. Then came the annihilation of the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima after its epic 18,000-mile voyage. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in modern history. Most important of all, Russia sued for peace. A larger and wealthier power concluded that victory was not worth the sacrifice. For Japanese planners in 1941, this precedent became template. Strike first, shatter the enemy fleet, establish a defensive perimeter so vast that retaking it would be prohibitively expensive, inflict casualties severe enough to force negotiation. America, like Russia, would decide the cost exceeded the prize. The logic appeared elegant. The flaw lay in analogy. Russia in 1905 was politically unstable, economically strained, and geographically distant from its Pacific ambitions. The United States in 1941 was industrially unified, resource-rich, and directly attacked. Yet Japanese strategists filtered evidence through cultural conviction. America's racial diversity, which to Americans was part of national identity, was interpreted in Tokyo as fatal weakness. A nation of immigrants, Germans, Irish, Italians, Jews, Africans, seemed unlikely to unite for sustained sacrifice. Homogeneity in Japanese eyes equaled cohesion, diversity equaled fracture. Democracy itself was viewed as strategic liability. Leaders accountable to voters, it was argued, could not sustain long wars. Parliamentary debate signaled indecision. Political opposition signaled fragility. Authoritarian decisiveness, by contrast, seemed efficient and strong. In this intellectual climate, Pearl Harbor was not reckless. It was rational within the framework of flawed assumptions. Yet not all shared the illusion. Standing apart was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the attack. Yamamoto had lived in America, studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, and later served as naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled through the American heartland, visited Detroit's automobile plants, observed Texas oil production, and spoken with ordinary citizens. He understood something many in Tokyo did not. America's apparent casualness concealed vast mobilization potential. The same factories producing sedans could produce tanks. The same oil fields fueling suburban expansion could fuel a two-ocean navy. Yamamoto, an avid poker player, appreciated risk in probabilistic terms rather than mystical ones. He knew when the odds were long. His warnings were precise, not emotional. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, he cautioned, knows Japan lacks the capacity for a sustained naval race. Yamamoto's tragedy was not that he failed to foresee disaster, but that he foresaw it with mathematical clarity and was powerless to prevent it. In a private letter dated January 24, 1941, addressed to politician Ryoichi Sasakawa, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto dismantled the illusion of limited war with brutal logic. If hostilities broke out, he wrote, it would not be enough to seize Guam or the Philippines. nor even Hawaii or San Francisco. To secure victory, Japan would have to march into Washington itself and dictate peace terms in the White House. This was not bravado. It was strategic reductio ad absurdum. Because conquering the continental United States was impossible, total victory was impossible. Therefore, war itself was irrational. Yet rationality had already begun to erode inside Tokyo's power structure. The Imperial Japanese Army, increasingly dominant in politics, viewed hesitation as weakness. Ultra-nationalist officers had assassinated moderates before. Dissent carried mortal risk. Yamamoto, precisely because of his caution, was placed at sea as commander of the combined fleet, both to utilize his brilliance and to shield him from extremists who saw his skepticism as betrayal. When conflict became unavoidable, he accepted a grim conclusion. If Japan must fight a war it could not win, then it required a commander who understood its limits. Pearl Harbor, in his conception, was never a pathway to decisive victory. It was a desperate attempt to buy time, 6 months, perhaps a year, during which Japan might fortify a vast defensive perimeter before American industrial mobilization reached full force. The popular quotation about awakening a sleeping giant, endlessly repeated and immortalized in the 1970 film Tora, 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 captures his sentiment, but not his voice. Historians have found no evidence he ever uttered those words. The line's cinematic power lies precisely in its accuracy of spirit, not authenticity of record. What Yamamoto did right, in a January 9, 1942 letter to editor Ogata Taketora, reveals his genuine tone. A military man could scarcely take pride in striking a sleeping enemy. It was a matter of shame for the one struck. Even in triumph, he sensed foreboding. The Imperial Conference of December 1, 1941, which formalized war against the United States, rested on 5 interlocking assumptions, each appearing plausible in isolation, together forming a fatal structure of self-deception. First, leaders believed American isolationism ran so deep that even a surprise attack would not fully extinguish it. The America First movement, congressional reluctance, and public war weariness were read as permanent traits rather than temporary moods. Second, they assumed distance would dull resolve. The Philippines, Guam, Wake. These were remote abstractions to Midwestern farmers and East Coast workers. Why would Americans bleed for islands they could scarcely locate? Third, planners calculated that crippling the Pacific Fleet would neutralize American power projection for at least a year, granting Japan the window Yamamoto had described. During that interval, they would erect a defensive ring stretching from the Aleutians through Midway, Wake, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, Rabaul, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. A perimeter so vast and fortified that breaching it would cost the United States more than it was willing to pay. Fourth, they expected Germany to keep Britain and the United States preoccupied in Europe, dividing American resources between 2 oceans. Finally, and most critically, they assumed that a democracy unwilling to absorb heavy casualties for distant colonial holdings would negotiate once the price became visible. Russia had done so in 1905. America would do the same. Beneath these calculations lay a current of fatalism. Admiral Osami Nagano articulated it starkly. If Japan faced national ruin, whether it fought or not, then it must choose to fight. Better annihilation in battle than spiritual surrender. They called it senshō-byō, victory disease. And like many diseases, it thrived in the bloodstream of success. After December 7, 1941, triumph followed triumph with such speed that caution seemed obsolete. Pearl Harbor had shattered the Pacific Fleet, killing more than 2,400 Americans and crippling battleships that symbolized U.S. naval power. Guam collapsed within hours. Wake Island resisted with astonishing defiance, even sinking Japanese destroyers in the only successful repulse of an amphibious landing during the opening offensive. Yet it too fell. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942, with some 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops laying down arms to General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The Battle of the Java Sea annihilated Allied naval resistance in Southeast Asia in a single, brutal engagement. The oil-rich Dutch East Indies capitulated. In the Philippines, after months of starvation and disease on Bataan, Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops, the largest capitulation in U.S. military history. The subsequent Bataan Death March left thousands dead. Corregidor fell. General Jonathan Wainwright would endure captivity until 1945. To Japanese planners, these events confirmed every assumption. Western powers were brittle, democracies weak, colonial empires hollow. By March 1942, some officers concluded their original war plans had been too cautious. Perhaps spirit truly could overpower steel. Victory disease matured into arrogance, rigidity, and the dismissal of warning signs. Yet the warnings were there. Wake's defenders had drawn blood. Bataan's stand had disrupted Japanese timetables, forcing diversions of troops and supplies. These were early indicators that American and Allied resistance would harden rather than dissolve. Tokyo chose to interpret them as anomalies instead of patterns. Then, on April 18, 1942, came an event that punctured the illusion of invulnerability. 16. B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the carrier USS Hornet, striking Tokyo and other cities in what became known as the Doolittle Raid. The physical damage was minor. The psychological damage was immense. For Americans reeling from months of defeat, the raid proved retaliation was possible. For Japan, it shattered the promise that the emperor's homeland would remain untouched. Fighter units were recalled for home defense. Strategic resources were diverted. More importantly, the raid strengthened Admiral Yamamoto's argument that American carriers had to be destroyed decisively. The Imperial Army, previously skeptical of risking a major fleet action, now supported a bold thrust toward Midway. Thus, victory disease combined with wounded pride to accelerate the very gamble Yamamoto understood was perilous. He had warned that if Americans resolved to fight, cities like Tokyo could not be shielded indefinitely. The raiders proved him right. In early June 1942, near a small atoll in the Central Pacific, the strategic imbalance Yamamoto feared collided with operational overconfidence. The Battle of Midway unfolded almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. On paper, Japan held superiority. 4 fleet carriers, additional supporting vessels, experienced air crews, and a complex plan designed to lure and destroy the remaining American carriers. The United States Navy, still reeling from earlier losses, should have been at a disadvantage. Yet American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications, allowing Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to position his limited forces for ambush. What followed was not a gradual shift, but a catastrophic reversal compressed into hours. Dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown found Japanese decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. In minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were ablaze. A 4th, Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. 4 irreplaceable carriers and many of Japan's most skilled aviators were lost. The material damage was severe. The loss of veteran pilots was worse. On paper, Midway should have ended in American catastrophe. Japan deployed seasoned aviators hardened by years of war in China and months of Pacific conquest. The United States brought 3 carriers, no battleships in support, and air groups filled with many pilots who had never faced combat. By traditional calculations, experience, numbers, operational reach, the advantage lay decisively with Japan. Yet war is not decided by paper strength alone. Hidden beneath the surface of the Pacific was an invisible weapon more powerful than armor plate: intelligence. At Pearl Harbor, inside a cramped basement office known as Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalytic team had penetrated the Japanese JN-25B naval cipher. They could not read every message, but they could read enough. Most critically, they identified the target designated AF. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz trusted Rochefort's judgment that AF meant Midway. When Washington hesitated, Lieutenant Jasper Holmes proposed a simple deception. Midway would transmit an unencrypted report that its water distillation plant had failed. Shortly afterward, intercepted Japanese communications noted that AF is short of water. Confirmation was undeniable. For the first time in the war, the United States would not react blindly. It would ambush. Nimitz committed virtually every available carrier: Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown. The latter had been mauled weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, so badly that Japanese planners assumed her sunk. In a feat bordering on the miraculous, Pearl Harbor shipyard crews compressed what should have required months into 72 relentless hours. Yorktown sailed with fresh welds still cooling, a floating symbol of American improvisation. It was a gamble rooted in intelligence. If Rochefort's assessment proved wrong, the Pacific Fleet would steam directly into annihilation. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the gamble met destiny. For hours, American torpedo squadrons attacked piecemeal and were devastated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was wiped out, 15 aircraft destroyed, 30 men killed, save for Ensign George Gay, who watched the battle unfold from the oil-slicked sea. Their torpedoes malfunctioned, their formations shattered, yet their sacrifice achieved something unseen. They dragged Japanese fighter cover down to wave-top altitude. Above, unseen and unchallenged, SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown searched desperately for the enemy. At approximately 10:20 a.m., they found him. Below them lay Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force in a state of lethal transition. Aircraft cluttered decks. Fuel lines lay stretched across planking. Ordnance was stacked in preparation for a strike against newly discovered American carriers. Nagumo had hesitated, first arming planes for a second Midway strike, then rearming for anti-ship attack when reports of U.S. carriers arrived. That moment of indecision created vulnerability measured in minutes. The dive bombers fell from the sun. Within 5 catastrophic minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were transformed into blazing wrecks. Explosions cascaded through hangars thick with fuel vapor. Firestorms rendered damage control futile. Only Hiryu remained operational, and she struck back fiercely, damaging Yorktown and briefly suggesting the battle hung in balance. But by afternoon, American dive bombers located Hiryu and condemned her to the same fate. 4 fleet carriers, the striking corps that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone. Along with them vanished more than 300 aircraft and roughly 3,000 highly trained personnel, pilots, mechanics, deck crews, specialists forged over years. Ships can be replaced, experience cannot. Midway was not merely a tactical defeat for Japan, it was a strategic amputation. The Imperial Navy could no longer replace elite aviators at the pace required for sustained carrier warfare. America's cost at Midway was painful but sustainable. 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, roughly 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Japan's losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Yet inside the empire, truth became a casualty as well. In coordination with Emperor Hirohito, the Navy concealed the scale of disaster. The battle was publicly described as success. Carriers resting on the ocean floor remained listed as active but unmanned. Wounded sailors were isolated in separate hospitals, family visits restricted. Survivors were reassigned to distant postings to prevent conversations. The Japanese public would not learn the truth until surrender made concealment impossible. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo reportedly contemplated suicide. Isoroku Yamamoto withdrew to his cabin, physically ill, his prediction fulfilled with merciless precision. The 6 months of unrestrained momentum had ended. But if Midway shattered confidence at sea, the jungles of Guadalcanal would erode it on land. 2 months later, on August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander Vandegrift stormed ashore in the Solomon Islands in America's first major amphibious offensive. The objective seemed modest: a half-completed Japanese airfield on a remote island few Americans could locate on a map. Renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, it became the fulcrum of a 6-month struggle that rewrote Japanese assumptions about American fighting quality. Tokyo had believed Americans lacked the stomach for prolonged ground combat. Guadalcanal disproved that belief in blood. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed with 916 men, convinced intelligence reports of a small, shaken garrison were accurate. On the night of August 21st along the Tanaru River, his force was annihilated. Roughly 800 Japanese killed. Ichiki burned his regimental colors and died in the fighting. It should have been a warning. Admiral Raizo Tanaka later reflected that the disaster exposed the futility of what he called bamboo spear tactics, frontal assaults driven by spirit rather than firepower. Yet the institutional mindset could not concede that American infantry had outfought elite Japanese troops. Explanations were sought that preserved pride. Too few men, wrong approach, insufficient preparation. More troops would correct the outcome. They did not. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi launched a 6,000-man assault at Edson's Ridge in September. It failed with devastating casualties. In October, General Masao Maruyama hurled approximately 7,000 troops against entrenched Marine and Army positions near Henderson Field. Repeated night assaults dissolved under machine gun fire and artillery. American defenders suffered comparatively light losses while inflicting thousands of Japanese dead. Among them stood Sergeant John Basilone, commanding heavy machine gun sections against overwhelming numbers. For days without rest, he kept his guns firing, hauling equipment under fire, cutting through enemy lines to resupply ammunition. Awarded the Medal of Honor, he deflected personal glory, insisting it belonged equally to comrades still fighting. He refused a commission and stateside safety. "I belong back with my outfit," he said. He would later die on the first day at Iwo Jima, leading from the front. Guadalcanal demonstrated something Japanese planners had dismissed. American soldiers, once engaged, fought with tenacity equal to any warrior code. The campaign also exposed logistical reality. Japan could not sustain distant island garrisons against an enemy whose industrial output was accelerating monthly. Ships lost in night battles could not be replaced at American rates. Pilots killed over the Solomons could not be trained as quickly as new American aviators graduating from expanding programs. The war had shifted from swift conquest to grinding attrition, and attrition favored the nation with deeper reserves of steel, fuel, and manpower. Victory disease had promised that spirit would compensate for material disparity. Midway revealed the cost of overconfidence at sea.